Have you ever wondered how your favorite nightmare-inducing action figures came to life?
It's alive!
Well, grab some silver bullets and wooden stakes, because today we're about to unearth the spine-chilling history of horror action figures that'll make your innermost monster howl with delight. Who wrote this? Oh, I did? Okay. From the dawn of horror toys to the golden modern era we currently enjoy, join me as we embark on a journey through time and explore the evolution of these iconic collectibles. But beware, this studio is about to become a dark and twisted place. Gorier than the dinner scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, more twisted than the bedroom scene in Terrifier 2, and even more horrific than the Star Wars holiday special. Prepare yourselves. Welcome to the dark and twisted world of horror action figures. My name is Matt, often called Big Nerdy. Together, we are the NWO, the Nerd World Order, and this is Nerdzoic. We have a lot to cover today, so we will be keeping this pretty high level, because if we went into like everything, this video would be longer than you can imagine, and I have a feeling it's gonna be pretty long anyway, so here we go. If we go back all the way to the beginning and try to find the first horror toy, it's kind of hard, but many people consider the Frozen Charlotte to be just that. The Frozen Charlotte was inspired by a Victorian-era porcelain doll and the American folk song Fair Charlotte. These were small figures, if you want to call them that, sold in silver coffins, and they were made from white porcelain. These were popular up until the 1920s, and they even had a male version called the Frozen Charlie. Let's hope he covered up. So that's the very, very beginning, but let's go back to where this really got rolling, and that's the 1960s. And that was the Aurora Plastic Corporation. They unleashed a wave of horror-inspired model kits upon the world. During this time period, TV syndication brought an uptick in interest in the classic Universal monsters that started to come out in the 1930s. So like Dracula, Bride of Frankenstein, Frankenstein's Monster, Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Mummy, you guys get it. The brainchild of artist James Bama, these kits transformed classic movie monsters into plastic masterpieces, at least by 60s standards. One of the charms of the Aurora model monster kits was their diversity. There was something for pretty much every horror fan, and each kit came with intricately detailed parts that hobbyists could assemble and paint to their heart's delight. But if you're like me, I want my figures to come painted, and that brings us to the 70s. So we've talked about these model kits, we've talked about porcelain dolls, and they're great and all, but they ain't action figures. For those, we had to wait all the way until the 1970s and the rise of Mego. No, not Vigo. You are but the buzzing of flies to him.
He's Vigo!
Mego, not Vigo. With the renewed interest in Universal monsters carrying over from the 1960s, Mego Toys saw an opportunity. So coming off striking gold with their superheroes line, Mego attempted to obtain the license from Universal so they could make themselves some monsters. But nah, Universal was like, no, we want this much. And Mego was like, no, we don't want to pay that much. And why are they all Italian? I don't know. But this led to the license going to 𝐒𝐸𝐿𝐼 International, which you probably know better as AHI. But Mego was like, screw you, we're gonna do this anyway, and they used their own interpretations of the characters from the classic literary works because they were in the public domain. Without having to pay licensing fees, they were able to do something that would never happen today. They put the money back into the toys. They didn't just pocket it themselves. They also had to be careful not to get sued. So we got an Irish-looking Dracula with Ronald McDonald hair and a blue-haired Frankenstein. So still not quite the golden era, right? Meanwhile, AHI, who remember they did get the license from Universal, they debuted their figures, and they were known as the world-famous Super Monsters. This was an 8-inch line produced by AHI, and it ran from 1973 to 1976. The line featured classic monsters like Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, Creature of the Black Lagoon, and they all closely resembled the classic Aurora monster models. These remain some of the most sought-after action figures in all of toy history, with some of them reaching some pretty staggering prices in the collector's markets. In 1973, Ben Cooper unveiled a lineup of rubber monsters with a standout series called House Haunters that featured characters like witches, devils, scarecrows, and stuff like that. Then came the Lincoln Monsters, perhaps among the quirkiest and weirdest unique monster figures ever created. These emerged as like the off-brand Kmart version of budget-friendly toys in 1974 and 1975. Around 1977 to 1978, Tomland produced a rare series of 8-inch monster action figures featuring characters like the Abominable Snowman, the Fly, Morlock, and Cyclops. Some of these were later redone and repackaged as Star Raider Space Aliens to capitalize on the Star Wars craze of that era. Now, toy history fans, you will notice that all all of these suspiciously resemble the Mego style. This just goes to show you the influence of Mego. As the decade ended though, and that style kind of waned with the influence of Mego, we saw a new style come up, and that was the Star Wars style, the 3.75-inch style that was the new belle of the ball, as we're about to see shortly. The 1980s were a pretty remarkable era for horror fans in general due to a new breed of horror characters that were introduced. Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and Pinhead are among the most iconic we have ever gotten. But you can't keep a classic down, and the 1980s brought yet another rebirth of the classic Universal monsters. In 1980, AHI, now operating under the subsidiary name you probably know better, which is Remco, introduced a new line of Universal monster toys. These action-oriented 9-inch figures feature glow-in-the-dark heads and button-activated monster grip. Despite some variations in quality, these 1980 Remco figures remain a notable part of classic monster history, marking the end of the era that began in 1973 with those AHI monsters and the Mego lines to the new stuff. Alongside their figures, Remco also offered accessories. They had a Monsterizer lab table and a haunted house carrying case, which were also pretty iconic for the time. Now, NEC has been doing their own homage to this line of late with modern versions of these glow-in-the-dark classics, so take a look out for them if you really want the old ones but can't afford them. In 1984, Ghostbusters hit theaters, and the movie bordered more on comedy than horror, but it still needs to be mentioned when you consider the franchise's long-term impact on toys in general, that were based more on the 1986 cartoon than the 1984 movie. Those 1986 figures, which were kind of horror kitty adjacent, they were awesome, and they remain popular to this day with retro versions being made. In 1986, Imperial Toy Corporation, which was known for its rubber toys in the 1970s, introduced an 8-inch vinyl figure that was available either loose, with tags, or on bubble cards. The design of the character seemed kinda lackluster, possibly reflecting waning interest in classic monsters, where they finally got to die off. Well, Imperial also released other vinyl figures, things like Godzilla, King Kong, Rodan, during the same era, often packaged in box sets containing 2 Universal monsters and 2 giant monsters. But like I said, interest in the classic was dying, so new things were being tried. In 1986, Hasbro introduced the Inhumanoids, a series of 14-inch giant mutant creatures that resided beneath Earth's surface. The line included a trio of monsters alongside smaller creatures, human scientists, and 2 vehicles. Despite being accompanied by a television series, the toys struggled to sell and remained on clearance shelves for a very long time. If there were Ollies back then, these would have been what was at Ollie's. In 1987, Mattel introduced the kind of charming but grotesque Boglins, which were swamp-dwelling creatures brought to life through 3 large rubber hand puppets. Not a joke. And a bit of toy history trivia, the Boglins concept had a big influence on Mattel's later released Street Sharks, which we all love. The 90s were another great time for horror fans and collectors, marked by the emergence of another instant classic horror franchise in Scream, and the decline in popularity and then eventual resurrection, yet again, of classic Universal monsters. In the early 90s, Playco attempted to create Universal Monsters action figures similar to the 1986 Imperial monsters. However, these figures had a really crude sculpt and reflected a decline in the popularity of the Universal monsters during that era. Featuring cartoonish faces, they were kind of generic versions of Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman, and the Mummy that we've gotten 1,000 times before. It seemed that nobody wanted Universal monsters no more. Or was it just that they wanted something different with their Universal monsters? Time will tell. And time did tell in 1997 when you'll never believe what returned. The Universal monsters. It's almost like a reoccurring theme here. Thanks to, of all people, the US Postal Service, a new series of stamps came out of Universal monsters and the craze was upon us again, which of course meant new action figures. Among these, Hasbro released 3 12-inch figures which were made on their Hall of Fame G.I. Joe body and were the first to be licensed by the estates of Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. Later figures in the line included the Bride of Frankenstein, Phantom of the Opera, Count Alucard from The Son of Dracula, the Invisible Man, the creature from the Black Lagoon, and Lon Chaney Jr. as Karis the Muffy. Karis the Muffy? No, Karas the Mummy, or Karis. I'm bad with names, folks. But with the new resurgence in Universal monsters, even Burger King got in on the action. In 1997, they had their own line of 4-inch 5 POA figures. The quality of these figures themselves was exceptional, and the promotional artwork linked to them was actually pretty impressive as well. In 1999, Flat World Figures introduced a highly detailed Bela Lugosi's Dracula figure, which was meticulously crafted with a lifelike head based on Bela Lugosi's life mask, which To me, is still kind of creepy, but there you go. However, playing a bit of spoiler, exclusive Premiere beat Flatworld to market with its own Bela Lugosi Dracula figure in the Mego style. But this figure was a bit different in that it fell into the 6-inch format, much like their exclusive Premiere James Bond figures. In 1994, Playmates, who's known for their successful Ninja Turtles and Star Trek toy lines, got in on the action by taking a bold step to introduce the intricate and peculiar action figures known as Skeleton Warriors. These figures, with their eerie appearance and intricate detail, garnered significant attention from both toy enthusiasts and industry observers. To go with the launch, we also got an animated TV series, but despite attracting interest from adults, the Skeleton Warriors failed to capture the imagination of children. Consequently, the figures remained on the shelves for a long time, just warming them up, and eventually they were later reintroduced as KB Toys exclusives. We need to talk about the most significant aspect of horror action figures in the 90s though. To sum it up, it was a substantial shift in the target audience for horror toys. For the first time in mass at least, we saw a new type of horror action figure introduced and eventually just completely take over the toy industry. This movement was really led by Todd McFarlane and Spawn. The toys became way more graphic, way more violent, and way more gory. Todd McFarlane, hereby known simply as Toddy Mac, gained fame as an artist for Marvel but left due to creative differences, and along with a bunch of other industry veterans, he launched Image Comics. At Image, he successfully created the aforementioned and highly successful comic book, Spawn. Now, Toddy Mac wanted some action figures based on his characters, but he wasn't happy with the existing toy manufacturers. So he said, screw it, I'm gonna make my own toy company. And so came TMP, Todd McFarlane Products. McFarlane released the Spawn action figures first, and they completely revolutionized toy design during that decade. Not just for horror toys, but toys in general. While other companies were making less articulated and less detailed toys, McFarlane figures were super articulated and hyper detailed. Before you ask, when I say super articulated, I mean for 1996-97, they were super articulated. And unlike everybody else who was toning down the gore and violence and character depictions, McFarlane intensified the grotesqueness of his creations, portraying crazily hideous disfigurements, malformations, and mutilations with his intricate sculpture and layered paint schemes. This had a huge impact on the rest of the toy manufacturers and completely reshaped the toy industry, as we'll see with other companies that come slightly after. In 97, Toddy Mac ventured into classic monster toys, filling a void in the market. Without obtaining licenses from Universal or Hammer Studios, he created his own version of classic monsters, each paired with a victim or adversary and an intricate diorama base priced under $10. Imagine that. This line included Frankenstein, Dracula, a werewolf, the Hunchback, all presented in Toddy Mac's distinctive exaggerated style. This line later evolved into Movie Maniacs, which focused on more recent characters like Jason, Freddy, and Leatherface. While the older guard of classic monster fans may not have embraced McFarlane's approach, his monster action figures were the first significant change in the action figure market in the 90s, and honestly, quite possibly the most influential since Mego in the 70s. He basically helped create a whole new market that allowed other companies like Sideshow and later NECA to come in and take chances on less traditional monster toys. The classic monster fad might have peaked in 1999 with Sideshow Toys. They produced an 8-inch line of Universal monster figures that many consider to be the very best, even up to today. I don't agree, which we'll talk about here soon, but these were pretty amazing, especially when you consider the time. At the turn of the century, things were changing. We still had the iconic monsters, but we also had the new slasher monsters, and still more new horror stuff was coming to the big screen and the small screen. That led even more companies to get into the horror figure market. While these new companies started to come out, Sideshow and McFarlane continued the horrific goodness that they ended the millennium with. To go along with their 8-inch figures, Sideshow created 2-inch little big head monster figurines, which I hate the word figurines. But in 2000, Sideshow introduced a line of 12-inch figures starting with Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster and later introducing characters like Dracula, and the Mummy, and the Wolfman. This was a time that had started to focus on specialty shops and mail order, and discontinued mass market production in 2001. And with this, they increased prices. To this day, this is the business model that Sideshow follows. In 2002, Palisades Toys came in with their licensed Resident Evil figures. The success of Resident Evil figures led Palisades to later produce a series called Cult Classics that featured various characters from both cult classic movies and horror films, such as Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But their biggest achievement was probably getting the Evil Dead license, which allowed them to produce action figures of the iconic Ash Williams character. Unfortunately, as many of you collecting at the time might remember, Palisades had some financial troubles, and in 2006 they filed for bankruptcy. The company ceased operations, marking the end of its horror action figure lines as well as everything else they did. Meanwhile, McFarlane was exploring modern horror movies with slasher characters from the Movie Maniacs line, followed by a return to the generic monster line in 2002. This time, he increased the figure size to about 6 inches, making them even more grotesque than ever before. This is about the time that Toddy Mac decided we're not just going to do classic monsters here. We're going to start doing our own interpretations. And he did. We got horror, grotesque, nightmarish versions of fairy tale characters like Hansel and Gretel, Little Miss Muffet, and Humpty Dumpty. That evolved into historical figures that we got horror versions of, like Rasputin, Elizabeth Bathory, and Jack the Ripper. And then, if that wasn't enough, we got a whole wave called Twisted Xmas. Twisted sums it up pretty well, because we got twisted versions of things like Santa Claus and Rudolph and Jack Frost, but Mrs. Claus might have kind of been the weirdest thing here, as she was clad in lingerie on a stripper pole that was actually a candy cane. Why not? In 2003, Robert Kirkman launched The Walking Dead comic, which gave a rise to something new: zombies. Zombies have been around for a long time, but they had kind of not been waning in popularity up until Walking Dead. But when the comic came out, McFarlane seized the opportunity to produce action figures depicting the crazy, gruesome-looking walkers, as well as some fan-favorite characters. McFarlane made a lot of horror toys, and for a long time, they pretty much ran unopposed at their price point. But then, in 2003, NECA burst onto the horror action figure scene. It started with the release of figures based on iconic characters based on the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises. This is where they made their bones in the horror industry. That's mafia talk, made their bones. Like McFarlane toys before, NECA's entry into the horror market signaled a significant shift towards catering to adults even more. This made sense because it aligned with the growing demand for high-quality, movie-accurate action figures. In 2004, NECA launched its Cult Classic series, which focused on figures from cult classic horror films. This series included characters like Chucky from Child's Play and Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Cult Classics line expanded NECA's horror figure offerings and demonstrated its commitment to catering to a broader range of horror enthusiasts. People who were not toy collectors started to buy this stuff because it looked cool and it was awesome, and suddenly people's desks at work had creepy-looking leather faces on it. NECA's later Cinema of Fear series solidified NECA's status as the leading producer of horror-themed action figures, offering a broad spectrum of characters and really taking the market from Toddy Mac. NECA was not the only new kid on the block during this era though, as Mezco also burst onto the scene. While known mostly for its 1/12 collective line, Mezco actually did quite a bunch of different things in its early history. In the early 2000s, Mezco unleashed the Living Dead Dolls line, which was a series of gothic-inspired dolls that became an instant cult classic. Mezco then went on to produce figures based on some of the iconic movie characters like Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and Leatherface. Their attention to detail and commitment to movie accuracy is really set it apart, and it was a higher-end figure for a long time than NECA. In 2007, Mezco introduced the Mezits line, which featured stylized compact versions of its popular characters. These figures appealed to collectors looking for a unique, desk-friendly collectible and showcased Mezco's adaptability. The 2010s really brings us to what we know today for horror figures, starting with NECA introducing their Ultimate figure line, which still runs today. Over at McFarlane, Toddy Mac continues to pump out the Spawn figures, but the horror figures have been on the back burner really since he got the DC Multiverse license, and it looks to continue to be that way for the foreseeable future. There are actually dozens of companies at this point producing horror action figures today, but that's going to have to be another video because there's a lot of them, and they can't all go here. NECA continues to produce horror figures though, especially as new movies come out, with a Halloween Kills version of Michael Myers coming out any day now. They also started in 2021 to produce Universal Monster figures, and that line has been a massive hit, both from a financial standpoint and also just from an execution standpoint. If you haven't noticed, I do have a bit of a favorite here. It's NECA. I love their horror figures. I love everything they do. In fact, if you want to see NECA's top 10 horror figures, check out this video here. And remember, gotta get old. You don't have to grow up. All you gotta do is be cool and stay nerdy, folks. Later.